for this evening, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Laura Loyola Hernández, who is based at the Department of Geography at the University of Leeds. She is a PhD student from Cambridge, who now currently holds a postdoctoral fellowship from the British Academy. And the research that she'll be talking to us about tonight is based on that postdoctoral fellowship. She also holds a lectureship at the Department of Geography. And she is going to speak to us today to the title of Cabecitas Blancas, the immobility of borders and notions of citizenship for Yucatecan migrant families. And I know that she is very interested to hear your questions and responses to the discussion after the presentation of some slides. So we will be opening the chat function and ask you to put down your questions in that chat, if you will, and I can read them out. But without any further ado, I'd like to very warmly welcome Laura Loyola Hernández.
Hi, hello everyone. Buenas noches. Thank you so much for inviting me and for joining me, especially during the second lockdown. I know it's super late. I know most of us are just really sick of being in front of a computer, so I really appreciate it. I know it's a bit late as well. So thank you. And yeah, if at any point you guys need to stretch, turn your cameras off so you can have a lay down but still listen, have a drink of water, just please feel free to do so, because it is asking quite a lot to be 2 hours in front of a computer. So thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Shen, for inviting me to present this. And as Sarah said, this is part of a larger project that I did, and it's the first time I'm presenting it. So again, I'm really happy to engage with people and hear what you guys have to say. So obviously this is not me giving a lecture, but I did do a bit of a PowerPoint because I wanted to show you some images and start with a video as well. So hopefully it will work, but if it doesn't, please let me know so we can see what I've done incorrectly. Okay, so hopefully you can see. Yeah, cool. Right, so as I said, this project was something that came out of a variety of things. On one part, it was me when I was in 2018 in Yucatan doing some research on the current, then current campaigns for municipal government, the state government, and president elections. And when I was in the municipalities, the constant discourse of migrants came up. So this is why I sort of went that avenue, but it's also connected to the type of activism that I do here in Leeds specifically. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. I just wanted to sort of give a content warning because I will be talking around issues around racism and white supremacy, colonialism, and towards the end around COVID-19. So again, if people feel the need to step away from the computer, or if you have any worries or comments, please let me know. But I just wanted to sort of, and some of us are migrants or have loved ones that are going through the process. So it could also hit quite home, close to home. So just to give that further context as well. So today, as I said, we're going to talk about these notions of citizenship, right? And how, at least I view them, and what I'm saying is not new, like Indigenous people, Black communities, Brown communities, globally, but especially in Abya Yala or Latin America, have been saying this for quite some time. But we're going to analyze, who has access to certain citizenship and documents that allows them to travel, and how that changes very rapidly according to politics, but also during the current global pandemic. So we're going to talk about that. And towards the end as well, I'm going to touch a bit about this concept of family separation, right? And how it's been framed during the pandemic versus this is something that's not only happening in the US, but also Mexico with its anti-migrant policies, but here in the UK and across the globe as well. And how these notions and impositions of borders are colonial legacies that can continue to inflict violence on Black communities, Indigenous communities, and lower income communities. So I wanted to start this talk with someone that I admire a lot, and I draw a lot from their poetry, their cultural work. And Alan was for 18 years an undocumented, originally from Oaxaca. So I just wanted to start us with this notion so that you can sort of see where I'm coming from politically, but also theoretically. So please let me know if you can't listen. I'll see if, so I'm just going to, because, okay. Okay.
So we'll see what y'all think. It's called Morning Verb, Vignettes on Imagining and Rebuilding Home. What do you do when a WhatsApp message appears and the sender is not in phone book? And what do you do when that message says your abuela has passed away and has already been buried? And what do you do when you cannot travel back to that country, state, pueblo, homeland, and what do you do if you do not know how to cry or ache and then cry? And what do you do when the poem does not come because the memories are not there? And what do you do when you have been undocumented for 17 years and you did not get to say goodbye? And why can't Google fucking have an answer, a diagnosis to why I do not feel the pain? And when will sitting in a dark bedroom with a laptop and Word documents stop replacing bodies? And why is it that the first time I take an interest in mezcal is 3 months after her death, when I Google best mezcal in San Francisco for under $50? It's funny how I think I can replace bodies with gastronomy. Mezcal doesn't resurrect. A body is not mezcal. A poem is not mezcal. Mezcal plus poetry does not equal abuela. I didn't start drinking that night, but damn right I did don drink. Label read Nuestra Soledad, 100% agave, Oaxaca, Mexico, bottled at origin. Funny how liquor can travel, but the body cannot. At least distributors didn't forget the accent on Mexico's E like I forgot all the memories of my fraternal abuela. I know all the excuses, but I refuse to give absent father, former father, the power to refuse all childhood memories. I finally visited my pueblo and the abuela's home. Her mother is still alive with dementia. She remembered me after 18 years of absence. I finally visited my pueblo, often reminding myself I was no ghost or in a REM cycle. It's difficult to believe you are home when you've been displaced for so long. I finally visited my pueblo, saw photos of abuela, her ama, and her abuela. For the first time, these poems are how I recuperate home. I finally visited my pueblo and made sure I brought it with me. There is an altar as proof. I finally visited my pueblo. There is an altar as proof. There is a poem as proof. Abuela, I was shown a photograph of your abuela. She carries a medicine pouch on her neck. It was exposed over her típica. Did you ever ask if it was intentional? Abuela, there is an altar in my room. Your abuela's photo rests on the wall above it. Have you spent time with your abuela while visiting me? Isn't it beautiful that the three of us can reunite during Sunday evening ceremony? Abuela, there is an altar in my room, an offering to your abuela. This is how the pueblo taught me to reassemble home. Abuela, there is an altar in my room, an offering to your abuela. Are you comfortable in our home? Is there anything that you need?
So I wanted to start with this poem because Alan speaks, I guess, from the other way around, in the sense that after being undocumented, after having to flee Mexico for his safety, for their safety, for their family safety, to return and to this notion of home, what is home, and how, migrants, undocumented people, people with precarious immigration status are dehumanized in every aspect, aspect of life. And how, for example, this program that I'm going to be talking about in reality is complicit with these borders, right? It does not change the system, it reinforces it. It gets to decide, who is worthy of help, who is worthy of having those documented, and under what conditions. Because as we will see later on, there are certain conditions that the families have to have in order to be able to access this program, to travel to the US to reunite with their families. So I just wanted to part from that. And a little bit more about where I'm coming from, again, politically, but theoretically as well, and what's feeding into not only what I'm talking about here, but the wider context of recognizing that, well, I have migrated both to the United States when I was little, and then returning to Mexico, and then coming here as a migrant. I've always had a type of document that has allowed me to access school, that has allowed me to access healthcare, to travel back home in some occasions. So again, it's sort of recognizing that I'm talking about this from a really a place of privilege, of also recognizing how my body is read in these borders, and when I am stopped and when I am not, and why. So again, my thinking and the arguments that I'll be making have really fed on, as I said, my activism with the Racial Justice Network and the support that we give Black and brown migrant communities here in West Yorkshire, specifically our pursuit of stopping the police being able to access immigration databases, that they can stop you on the spot and scan you, and anyone who has an immigration status will have this flag up, so you can be detained by the police. If you want more information about that, I can talk about that towards the end, but we just launched a report on that. And as I said, Alan, whose poetry you just heard, also Bradford poet, spoken word poet Suhaima Mansour Khan, who also talks about the violence of borders, that even if she specifically talks about the UK, but it can be seen in wider global connections, that even if you are born in this country, you will never be seen as of this country. You will always have that systemic violence inflicted upon you and your body. And some of the other scholar activists that I address. But if people want me to talk about specifically about one of the theories that I'm talking about, just let me know. Right, so I'm a geographer, so it would be a bit weird if I didn't show a map, but just in case people don't know where Yucatan is, it's located in Mexico in the southern part. And it has, well, Mexico is a federal entity, so it's separated between, well, now 32 states, if you consider Mexico, La Ciudad de Mexico, Mexico City. And each state is separated into municipalities. Yucatan has one of the largest number of municipalities with 106. And this gives each municipality certain independence to make decisions. And I was in Yucatan in 2018 for the elections, and I was there in the southern part of Yucatan, which is called El Cono Sur. So right at the bottom, if you can see. And I was there exploring the ways emotions are mobilized in campaigns. So I was there doing at different levels. So I was tracing local mayors' candidacies. I was also looking into Senate seats and also AMLO's campaign as well. And again, one of the things that continued to emerge was people being scared of being deported back to Mexico, and what would be AMLO's position, not only towards supporting people that have been deported, but more large of I guess, standing up against the US policy in general towards Mexico. So Yucatan is considered an indigenous state, and this is the official way of measuring who is indigenous again, and it's very problematic, and I will go into that in a bit later on. But one of the ways in which the government classifies someone as indigenous is through language, if they speak Maya. But that's very complicated, because it gives the state, the state that erased you in the first place, the power to designate who is indigenous and who isn't, but also the measurement of, for example, language. Some people that speak Maya do not identify as Maya, and some people that cannot, or can't speak Maya, identify as Maya. And again, it doesn't consider why the violence inflicted towards Maya people to stop speaking Spanish, especially after, for example, the revolution, the Mexican Revolution in the 1920s, and the expansion of the education system to rural areas, and a real emphasis of everything has to be in Spanish, and you have to speak Spanish correctly, right? So again, it's really problematic as to who is considered indigenous. And this is an important point, because the program that I'm going to talk about is run by In the Maya. And In the Maya, one of the main reasons that it came about was because of multicultural policies in Mexico. So as I was saying, Cabecitas Blancas, which is a program I will be talking about, is run by In the Maya. In the Maya, el Instituto para el Desarrollo de la Cultura Maya del Estado de Yucatán. So it roughly translates to the Institute for the Development of Maya Culture in the state of Yucatan. And as I said, it was created in 2000 as part of multicultural policy. So this was literally a law that came into place. And this institute, first and foremost, is to promote the Maya culture, okay, and the preservation of that Maya culture. But again, it's this sort of paradox of you're having an institute that represents the state, that has historically erased indigenous people, that has inflicted violence upon indigenous people, especially Maya people in this region, having to sort of validate who is indigenous, who gets resources, etc. So, for example, one clear example of this is in 2005, there was a campaign, Huellanone, which means here we are, and it was mostly about the message of being proud of your language, and being proud of La Maya, and how La Maya is spoken in everyday life. And it was a lot of emphasis on cultural, so they do a lot of, for example, poetry contests, etc. But the emphasis again is in cultural, and it doesn't really address a structural change needed. So for example, it would be actually having into law that everything has to be bilingual, that children need to be taught both in Maya and Spanish, for example, that everything in official has to be in both Maya and Spanish, in official records, etc. At a municipal level, in the municipalities that, I mean, I've done research. Well, I'm from Yucatan, but I've done research about politics in municipal spaces in Yucatan for over 10 years. It really comes down to the municipality and the mayor of wanting to implement certain measures, like putting Maya words on the city municipal buildings, for example, to highlight being proud of being Maya. But a lot of the times it's because they are Maya themselves and they are women, and they're trying to bring that element of pride. And as I said, this institute, its first goal was to, they just thought they were going to make this institute and it was going to be cultural heritage, but they quickly realized that a lot of people, especially from other parts outside of Mérida, which is the capital, were going to India Maya to seek help, especially because either they themselves had been deported or they had families that had been forced to go to the United States for security or jobs, etc. So I just wanted to show the structure and how, for example, legal attention towards migrants. So they help, as I said, not only people that have been deported, but they help with the American consul, run Social Security. So register to get your Social Security, or if there's a pension, for example, if you're getting a divorce, all of this in this sense, they help. They also help register a child, for example, born in the US, and then they've come back as well. And as part of this, the program Cabecitas Blancas emerged. So what I did was interview people from the communities that had been affected or had been part of Cabecitas Blanca, but also I wanted to penetrate these spaces of politicians to understand where the program had emerged and how this was possible given the current political climate with Trump in power. So this is just a brief overview that despite Yucatan not being of Mexico and in the United States, most of the migration that happens in Yucatan is from within. So people, let's say from a municipality like Muna, possibly going to a larger municipality like Mérida, the capital, to migrate for work. So very few, like less than 1% actually migrate to the United States, but still the number of people that do or are forced to migrate have certain characteristics, which are that they come from rural areas, and a lot of them come from no one has a question. It's okay. Okay, I think it was one of those tech things. But yeah, if people want me to go slower or have questions, let me know as well, because I know I can be quite fast, and I know some people need a bit of time to process the images and the text as well. So now talking about the program, it's called Cabecitas Blancas. Like in Mexico, Cabecitas Blancas is a way of talking about our elders as well. So this program was, it emerged in April of 2016. And it was because Doña Paulita, as she's known, went to India Maya to talk to the director because she needed help economically to bring or repatriate her son's body, who had unfortunately passed away in San Francisco. And she had not seen her son for 18 years since he left home at 15. So out of that conversation, the then director said, no podía haber más Paulitas en el estado. There couldn't be any more Paulitas in the state. So she went and talked to the then governor, Rolando Zapata, to see if it was possible to coordinate or have some type of program that would allow them to, parents that had not seen their kids for a very long time because they were undocumented. This is a very unique program. There isn't any other program in Mexico, in the country, like this. It emerged in Yucatan. It's been running for 4 years. It started with the end of the Obama administration. It's currently, well, right now it's in pause, but it was also running during the Trump administration. So I was very interested in also knowing how the change in government had affected not only this program, but more generally the type of support that In the Maya was providing people that were living in the United States, but their family in Yucatan as well. And one of the things that we need to remember is, you know, Obama was the deportation president. I mean, he deported more people than other administrations. He also implemented, was the first to implement family separation as well. So the actual numbers, for example, of people being deported back to Mexico hadn't really incremented under Trump, at least in Yucatan, like people returning to Yucatan. What obviously had increased was the emotion, the sense of it could be imminent, like you could be deported at any moment. So I want to talk about the program Cabecitas Blancas because it's very bureaucratic and complicated, and it's not easy gaining access to the program. So as I said, the program is for parents who have not seen their children at least 10 years. Their children's have, like their kids have to be undocumented. The parents have to be at least 60 years or older. And they can only stay for 2 months at a time. And obviously the parents have to then return. So what does the program do? The program is basically like a logistical center. So they put out this call via Facebook, network connections, mouth to mouth. The migrant children or the people that are in the US then have to contact via email the institute, and they have to give all sorts of information. Now remember, they are undocumented, and this is one of the conditions for the program. And one of the things that continuously emerge in the interviews is how grateful In the Maya was with the American consul because they had implemented a firewall with the data that they obtained, because it could possibly lead to these people's deportation. So that's one of the key things that they really wanted to accentuate. And as of today, no one involved in the program has been deported. And again, when I was interviewing the director, one of the conditions was that the day someone does get deported because of the program, because of access to that information, is the day the program ends, because that's not the end point of notion of what information they need and why it's so, it takes an incredible amount of trust towards the government, both the Mexican and the US government, to have this type of information, because the children that are, the kids that they're not kids anymore, the children that are in the US have to send all type of information that the amount of time that they've been living in the US, their birth certificates, if they're married, even better. They have to send photos of their house, the condition of their house. One of the things that was highlighted is that, for example, there might be a case of someone that hasn't seen their parents in like 20 years, but they share a house rent with 5 other people. They would not qualify for this program because this is the reasoning that they gave me, is that the parents wouldn't have a proper place to stay. So they were, again, thinking that only families could apply and that they had a certain way of living, right? So even if they rented, the house had to be, in good condition, etc. So we've talked about, the people in the US applying for this are undocumented, but we have to remember that some of the parents here are also without certain papers. So whether that's either birth certificates, because they might be from a comisaria really far, or they've never had a passport, for example, and just going through all that process. So one of the directors said that the program was basically tramitología. I don't know how to translate this to English, but it's basically like, I don't know, like bureaucracy, but like to the 10th level. And that's basically the program in itself. And this is just the process of what they have to do, of migrants in the US sending an email. They have to wait at least 5 days. Then they get an acknowledgement. Then they have to send everything scanned, all the documents that I've just discussed. And their parents have to bring the documents to Indamaya. So this is where municipal authorities come in, because they support the parents by, for example, bringing them to Mérida. So some live 2-3 hours away, for example. So the municipalities then bring them to Mérida so that the Indamaya can have a look at their papers and check that everything's okay. Sometimes they need help, for example, getting a passport. So they will make, because now all the appointments are online, even pre-COVID, now even more. So Indamaya really is about taking them each step of the way. Once they've been accepted in the program, they have a visa appointment, and this is where the relationship with the American consul in Merida works, because they block out entire days only for the people in the program to go and have their interview and have their fingerprints and everything like that taken. And the Indamaya personnel are allowed to stay during the interview. So I don't know if anyone has ever done an immigration interview, either for the US or here in the UK, but you have to go at it by yourself. So this is one of the things that the consul has allowed them to do. Once the visas are approved, they are handed to Indamaya. They're not given to the families. So again, it's again the state. So the visas go to Indamaya, and this is where the logistics of the actual trip take. So Indamaya has to book flights. They all go together and they all leave together. And then they might land in Portland, and someone might live in Seattle. Well, they'll have to drive to Portland, pick their parents up, and when they have to leave, come back. And I have to say, all of the expenses are absorbed by the migrants living in the US. So the Indamaya doesn't pay anything. The government doesn't pay anything. It's the migrants in the US that have to pay everything, and on top have to prove that they can not only maintain their parents during the time there, but let's say if there were a medical emergency, that they would be able to afford, because healthcare in the United States, it's quite expensive as well. So this is basically the process, and I really wanted to go over that because you can see this sort of reaffirmation of the intervention of the state at every point, even if it's on a very sort of local level in that sense. And I guess this is where part of my theorization comes into play in the political context. So I've talked a bit about the US context of, and it's happening even now with Biden coming into government as well, and having all these diversity hires in the government that really are just implementing the U.S. imperial sort of states, but through you know, the notion of democracy, but democracy to who? And Alan, for example, whose Instagram handle is Migrant Scribble, really speaks up against Latinidad and Mexico as a white settler colonial state towards Black and Indigenous communities as well. And I want to bring this into perspective as well, not only with past administrations, but especially what's happening now with AMLO. And that AMLO has basically taken a very anti-migrant policy towards other migrants, so especially Central American migrants. We can see with the Caravana de Migrantes coming in from Central America, but are not only from Central America. We've seen people from Haiti and other parts of the world coming in through Mexico. And I also had, I interviewed the director in Yucatan of the Migration Institute. And during that conversation, it was quite evident that because of AMLO's hard line of anti-migrant policies, that the Institute was no longer capable of being able or equipped to handle the amount of people that they had to detain in detention centers. So I want to put it, I'm talking about this in the wider sense because these type of programs, you know, there's a wider global connection to who gets to move in borders and who has access to documents and notions of citizenship, and that these type of programs are not going to dismantle the state. They aren't going to dismantle the state because the state is colonial and it's designed that way. And it will always find a way to reinvent itself. For example, through these programs, right? And I want to talk about some of the themes that came up in the interviews that I did as well. So one of the themes was this constant reference to the program, on the people that work in the program as you know, we're there to assist. But in Mexico, you know, framing it historically with programs or government programs that have been, you know, around asistencialistas, paternalistas, of creating this client relationship, one has to sort of question, and also the political use of this program, because this program has been used for political gain, not only at a state level, but for example, in a municipal level, during campaigns, you know, mayors, for example, that were seeking re-election would say, oh, but I support migrants because I've done this for this program, etc. So again, it's this sort of danger that comes with these type of government programs. One of the most shocking things that I found in the interviews was, so a lot of the parents that travel to the US to see their children are women. And it's this notion that these women are the ones that are the, how do you say it in English? You know, they are the ones where the culture lives, right? So they have to have their huipil, for example, and I'll show you some of the quotes that they were said. But at the end of the day, all of the interviews from the past 4 years of people that have been in this program always saw these elderly people, they're human beings that have been stripped away from their kids, as almost like as promoters of culture, and this is how they would say that they were. And I'll show you again some quotes as well. And I was really, taken back by these type of comments, because they weren't seen as almost, as human beings, at the same time that they had to prove their humanity in a sense via not being able to see their children for X amount of time, that they were married, etc. But at the same time, they were seen almost as commodities to promote the state, to promote the government, etc. And again, this just sort of feeds into what Bell Hooks calls the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy as well, and that it was just focused on women as well. As I said, there was like this eternal gratitude with the American government, emphasizing that they were super benevolent, that they had allowed this program, and that they had this firewall. But again, it doesn't address the structural issue as to why people, both the Mexican government and the US government, as to why people feel the need to have to leave their communities and be displaced and having to go somewhere else, but also the violence that comes with not having documents. And why do certain people have access to documents while others don't? And finally, it was this reinforcement of heteronormativity, because they had to be married, like they had to be parents, and they had to be children, right? So it's assuming that it's a nuclear family and it's been separated. So again, it just reinforces this notion. I apologize, I did not have time to translate the quotes, but I'll just briefly translate it as I go. So the first quote says that the grandparents are like the keepers of culture. They not only take the love that they have for their family, but also their culture, our traditions, our food, our ways of dressing. And then the other one says that the elderlies, the elderly women, when they fly with their huipil, they fly as they are, as if they couldn't or aren't something else, for example. Another, for example, is that they were able to travel and take our culture in a very diverse country, right? And yeah, this notion again of love, of rescuing what's Maya, it's almost like a romanticization of the culture, but yet again not addressing structural inequalities as well as to why this program needs to exist in the first place. For example, this quote of a Yucatecan grandma, that it's really emotional seeing her with her huipil in La Mission Street in San Francisco, and that she's always well received in a country that's so diverse and has so many nationalities and cultures. But again, it's also romanticizing what happens in the US. As I said, not only with Obama, but especially with Trump, in the sense of the rhetoric, anti-migrant, racist, xenophobic, white supremacy rhetoric under the Trump administration. So it's really a disconnect from reality and what's happening. And this is the last quote. Again, it's sort of this: we're really, really super grateful with the American government, and that the information as well is there's a firewall, so the information isn't shared, so that people can't get deported. So I guess, and just very briefly, this program continued last year. The last people in the program went to the United States in February of 2020, but of course, COVID-19, the pandemic hit and closed borders, and they were stuck 5 months all across the US. And the last group were finally able to return in July. But I just wanted to sort of highlight this and bring it back to some of the things that happened because of COVID-19. So for example, Portugal gave citizenship rights to migrants, including undocumented. Spain not only gave basic income to everyone, including undocumented and asylum seekers, but they also closed detention centers as well. Ireland, I know, implemented a firewall between healthcare systems and immigration enforcement. So this just sort of shows that how arbitrary these borders are, and how arbitrary gaining that citizenship is when people in power want to shift it or change it. And I wanted to bring it back to AMLO, and I mentioned this at the beginning. He has had a very strong anti-migrant policy, and on top of his policy towards COVID-19, like for example in this photo when the pandemic first hit, he said that, you know, he was okay. He didn't need protection because he had these, you know, in Mexico, yeah, there are these like saints that will, you know, protect you in a sense. We now know that AMLO has COVID this week. So COVID-19 has really pushed or reinforced inequalities, not only socioeconomic, but towards migrants as well. And it's not only the case of Mexico, for example. Colombia also had tried to negate migrants getting the vaccine, for example. We know that community support groups have popped up all around the world to try to support migrants, especially those that are caught up either in the asylum process or have precarious undocumented status, because you're forced to go out to work because you don't have access to any of having documents allows you to. Yeah, so I think I've already said this argument, but borders are colonial impositions. Mexico is a colonial state. It has and continues to inflict violence towards Afro-Mexicanos and also indigenous communities. And the irony of having a program that allows you to have access to documents, which the state has continuously negated. We can't change states because the nature of the state is to have borders and is to protect you know, the natural resources, to continue with the elites. And these type of programs like Cabecitas Blancas continues this image of, you know, you have to prove that you're worthy to the state for help, that you have to prove your humanity in a sense, to sort of implore, for example, that you've not seen your children for 15-20 years for you to be worthy of having that help. And as I've said throughout the talk, they do not address or dismantle the systemic violence that has located them in the first place in these positions, both in Mexico and Yucatan, but also in the US. And the concept of citizenship is easily movable for certain people that are often white, that are often from higher income. And yeah, just this is sort of where my arguments are coming from. And yeah, I think that's it for the moment. So thank you for keeping up with me and for sharing space with me, so I could discuss this as well.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was absolutely fascinating. And it certainly represents a very interesting sort of re-articulation of multiculturalism, as you mentioned, but also I was thinking that it's quite different to the dynamics that we saw at the end of the 1990s and into the 2000s, where the states of Latin America were often very interested in kind of keeping connections to their their sort of migrant populations located elsewhere, because they wanted access to part of their income, and there were a lot of programs supporting remittance return and so on. And so this sort of emphasis on the sort of familial and the cultural and so on is really fascinating. If I can just start us off on the questions, I'm sure there will be very many. I'll give people a chance to sort of write them into the chat function. But my question, I suppose, comes from, or you know, I'm intrigued to understand how you see this program operating in relation to citizenship and to the particular jurisdictions. Because while you emphasize the importance of it as a Mexican program and one which is reliant upon actors and institutions within Yucatan, and of course it is facilitating that family reunion for Mexicans in Mexico. I was also wondering what you might say about, what does it tell us about the sort of, you know, these very complex spaces of citizenship arising from the fact that in some respects the undocumented workers in the United States on not, you know, that they are nominally Mexican, but they are also positioned in a very different polity. And I just wondered if there's sort of something to be said for trying to sort of understand this very complex sort of imagined space and what that does to our notions of citizenship. Because you were highlighting the importance of borders as colonial legacies, and I completely understand where that's coming from. But I just wonder whether we also need to consider the sort of, you know, the practices by which people have been able to exert certain rights in the United States through this process as well.
So if I understand correctly, it's more, your question is more oriented as towards the people living in the United States. So like the other part of the program?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I can only sort of think through it because I obviously I didn't interview, you know, my focus was more on the Mexican side versus the people in the US for a number of reasons as well. I think it depends on where they're located, because being an undocumented, for example, in California, it's not the same as being an undocumented in North Carolina. We know that, for example, undocumented people in California can have access to a driver's license, for example. And I know that during at least the first wave of COVID-19, they were able to access government help, even if they were undocumented. So here again, it's very different, I guess, as well, especially how the US works, because it is a federal state as well. States have different powers. And again, I think it depends if you're in a sanctuary city that in the US has a very different meaning than, let's say, here in the UK, and you have certain rights. So I think we first need to sort of consider those dynamics, because we can't homogenize the experiences of undocumented people in the US, A, but B, you have another set of things. You know, it's not the same being an Afro-Latino migrant than being a Maya undocumented, to being someone that's considered white in Mexico, but yet undocumented, and then thus racialized by the US government as a person of color. So I think for starters, we need to sort of add on, I guess, more complexities in order to understand that. And at the end of the day, this program doesn't allow them to have access as US citizens. You know, it does give them certain mobility in the sense of being able to reconnect with their parents physically, because they've been reconnected via, you know, phone, computers, etc. Because they are Mexican citizens. Because they are Mexican citizens, they do have access to this program, even if they are from the US, right? So that's a way of how I would envision it in a sense, in those two aspects. So while they don't have access to citizenship to the US, they might have certain access depending on where they are, but because they are Mexican citizens and they do have these certain characteristics, then they were able to access this program to bring their parents and let them into their home that they've built for the past couple of years. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's sort of how I view it.
No, that's fascinating. And I think you're quite right. The sort of disaggregating at the different spatial scales and across the US, as well as, of course, within Mexico, is a really interesting kind of consequence of your discussion. I'm very happy to read out a question from Sarah Abel, who says, thanks for a fascinating presentation, Laura. Could you give a sense of who the Indie Maya staff are? Are they local to Yucatan? Are there any staff who identify as indigenous? And also from Sarah Abel, are any...
Yeah, I can read the question.
Oh,
I can
okay,
read the
yes,
chat, so it's okay.
Probably, yeah.
It's okay. Okay, so I'll thank you, Sarah. I'll answer it. I can't see you, but I'll answer it in oh, I see. I'll answer it in pieces. So the staff are from Yucatan. It always comes into question if they can speak Maya or not. So some of them can speak Maya and some of them can't, but they are the only institute in the state that have official translators. Because of different laws that are now in place in Yucatan, they have to have, municipalities now have to have legal translators for oral, what's it called, like juicios, like legal cases. And so they do have people that will accompany people in the program that might not speak Spanish, for example, or have difficulties understanding it. I mean, at least not publicly or officially, will sort of talk about, you know, racism does not exist in the vocabulary of state policy in general. I mean, my experience with interviewing Maya indigenous mayors and candidates, which I did my PhD on with Sarah, was they would talk about their personal experience of racism when they left their municipality, especially going to government offices in Merida, which are more, you know, there's a lot more white people there or people that are not Maya speakers, etc. But there's absolutely no talk about racism in general, because again, I think there's this romanticization, and not only of multiculturalism, but if you look back at how Mexico was founded after independence, of mestizaje, of la raza cósmica, it's very much about whitewashing Mexico, of putting up white people and white mestizos on top of and romanticizing indigenous culture, but at the same time negating their presence and their resistance to these sort of colonial impositions, and completely erasing Black Mexicans and Afro Mexicanos into the national scheme of things. And then you had another question. Yes, and so in each of these trips, there are personnel that accompanies them. So if it's their first trip, they literally go with them until they are delivered like this to their family members, and that's for the first trip. There have been, once they return to Yucatan, there have been occasions where they then independently go and visit the family again, because they get a visa for 10 years. And they do that then independently, but they've all come back. They've not had a case where somebody has overstayed, because they really do emphasize that if one person, oversteps, then the entire program falls down. I hope that answered your question.
There's a question from Lucia. Would you like me to read it out?
Sure.
This is from Lucia Rojas. Thank you, Lara. This was fascinating. Please, I would like to know if within the tramitologia you had to prove that you are indigenous and how that worked.
Hola, Lucia. No, you don't have to. So this is just, within the people that are having access to the program. It's not that it's a requirement that they have to be Maya, but it's just something that keeps coming up, that they are mostly Maya elders that have not seen their children and that are outside of Merida, but especially in the Cono Sur, so in the southern part of the state. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a requirement, but it's just how, the people accessing that program. And again, it just brings to question, why is it this population that does not have access to the documents so that they will allow them to see their children. Okay. So I think there's another question. So I think Sean has a question about the requirements for a marriage certificate on the part of the parents. What is the logistic they express behind this? Can people participate if they are not married? And also, what kind of scale does this operate on? How many visits a year, for example? Okay, so again, the parents, so the ones that are in Yucatan don't necessarily have to prove that they're married, but if the parents are still together, they have to demonstrate that through the marriage license. So, I know you guys are kind of shocked, but if you've ever gone through an immigration system, I just applied for my indefinite leave here in the UK, and I had to prove that I had lived with my husband for 5 years and showed at least 6 different bills each. So this type of proving your private life to the state to be able to border cross is not just delimited to this type of program. It's everywhere, including the UK. So yeah, so again, like there have been cases where parents are divorced, for example, or that they are widows as well. One of the things that I also wanted to mention is sometimes the parents themselves, so the elderly parents, have been migrants themselves maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, and were deported or came back or had some type of infraction in the US. And initially they don't want to say this, because they're fearful that they won't get the visa in order to see their kids. And one of the things that in the Maya personnel have to there was one case that where this had happened, and in the Maya had appealed for a humanitarian visa, so only a visa for the 60 days. So like a one-time off visa where one of the parents could go and see their kids, for example. And so the scale of the visits, so each group is around 60, and they're separated maybe 25 at a time as well. And they started quite slowly, but the demand now is very, very high. Well, at least it was until COVID-19, because now it's all paused because of, the borders are closed. And I guess also the danger of, because they are within the vulnerable population of COVID-19. But they were doing, in 2019, when I interviewed them, they were doing between 3 and 4 trips a year. And again, wanting it to do more, but there's more demand. So even though the kids in the United States pay for everything on the parents' behalf, the institute still has to absorb the cost of staff going to the trips, of logistics, and et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things I didn't mention as well is that with AMLO, there's been a huge cut in the money, federal money going into the states, and then obviously that affects the budget that goes into the institute as well.
I asked permission from Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool. I mean, I was just interested just to follow up a little bit on the sort of marriage certificate thing. I mean, I suppose my kind of slight shock at the parents have got to prove that they're married if they're together is partially connected, I think, to this sort of notion that you've got to clearly be some kind of moral person in order to be allowed to participate in this program. Whereas I read some of the kind of stuff that, like you talked about with the UK immigration, as a kind of a strategy to prevent people from being able to successfully gain kind of migration status, and actually to just make it harder and harder and harder for them to do it, which is kind of inflicted, so, and it sounds like it's about living together as much as it is about being married. And so I was quite, this kind of notion, unless you're kind of, maybe I'm wrong, I mean, unless you're sort of playing.
No, yeah, I mean, I guess for me they're tied together. Like in the UK, it's not, obviously, hostile environment policies are there to deter migrants, that, for us to want to go back home and to leave the country. But one of the things also, as you said, all these things that you need to prove, again, is to prove that you're worthy of staying here. Yeah. It is this moral sort of sense of, okay, we deem you worthy, so we will give you a document. I mean, when you apply for your visa, when you apply for your indefinite leave or for citizenship, you have to have a good character. Like if even children applying for citizenship have to have at least 2 professional references to look at your good character. So yes, obviously this is to deter people and make it a lot more difficult, but I think it's also tied into, who has a right to be here, and with their children. So I don't think the US immigration system works in the sense of that they would be able to apply to naturalization. I mean, one of the things that I didn't mention as well is I didn't want to show any images or videos of the encounters or the promotional material, because they're very much white people helping, indigenous people and objectify them in that way. But the encounter sometimes is the grandkid that left with their parents when they were 7 months old and they hadn't seen their grandma, for example. I mean, they would now be dreamers under the Dreamers Act, for example, but their parents wouldn't be, right? So they would be undocumented. So I think, yeah, I don't think there would be a possibility of naturalization. There is local organizations. I know, for example, in San Francisco, that there's a big Yucatecan community, also in Oregon as well, I think North Carolina as well. So, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be organizations, but we see it here as well, community advocates, community groups just getting together. So whether that's supporting each other through this process, word to mouth, or for example, during COVID-19, caring for each other as well. So I guess the other question that you had is, there are no overstayers in the program, at least so far. So I guess that was your second question, Joseph.
While we're waiting for other questions, I thought I would ask you to say a little bit more about why you think that there seem to be a large number of applicants to this program coming from the particular part of the Yucatan that you've identified in the south. Is it that a particular history of migration from that region? And do we know anything about the sort of particular labor markets that they were going in, or the sort of nature of the chain migration that maybe led to that? Do you have any information?
So the El Cono Sur, so where, I mean, that's not to say that they've gotten applications from other municipalities,
of course.
but the majority so far have been from El Cono Sur, which is mainly agriculture. So like, oranges, bees, working with the land in that sense. So that's where a lot of the migration has happened. But also, these are some of the municipalities with the most amount of indigenous population, also classified by the government. But also, they're the least to receive funds from the government, both federal and state. They're, especially if they're from comisaria, so further away from city hall, for example, they might not have the infrastructure, so roads, electricity. There might be one school as well, but the majority, at least from the time in the same way that people in the US are mobilizing against the US government, they are mobilizing not against the Mexican government, but trying to obtain, basic human rights. For example, with AMLO, for example, there's La Guardia Nacional, which he created, which has been more towards the militarization of security, and it has been used against migrant caravans coming from Central America, especially in the border with Guatemala and Chiapas, for example. So a lot of the times migrants that have been stopped in Chiapas, for example, then are now getting shipped to Yucatan, because Yucatan, it's a lot further from the border, and they have the capacity to take them. So I know that doesn't really answer your question, but I wanted to sort of highlight as well that violent migrant processes are also happening in Mexico. And I think that's also part of the colonial logic of you know, rejecting people outside your borders, especially people that, you know, are from Black and brown communities or indigenous communities. Again, because it's all about protecting, you know, the white settler nation, that we don't often think of Mexico like that, because they teach us the mestizaje and la tercera raíz and that type of stuff. You know, we had AMLO as well when he became president. He made an offering to indigenous people, and I don't know if you guys remember, and it was all this like big performance. But now he wants to do the Tren Maya, which is a train that is basically going to run through the entire Yucatecan Peninsula, and the indigenous communities do not want it because it's going to destroy their way of living in that sense. Yeah, so I guess it's just sort of the complexities that come with, it's not just happening there, but we're also being border enforcers in Mexico, but here as well, and trying to understand those dynamics.